True War Encounters, Jake McNiece. How Jake McNiece used Beretta M38 in 1944 with aggressive control to reclaim a position. The fog over the Norman hedgerows carried voices McNiece didn't recognize, sharp German commands echoing from inside the stone barn 200 yards ahead, the barn that had been theirs. The observation post overlooking the southern approach to the blown bridge at Carrington, where American engineers were still stringing charges along the causeway, working against dawn and against the clock. Jake McNiece crouched in a flooded ditch, cold water seeping through his jump boots, and stared at the Beretta M38 in his hands. The Italian submachine gun felt wrong. Lighter than his Thompson, unfamiliar grip, foreign markings etched along the receiver. He'd pulled it off a dead engineer 3 days earlier, some poor bastard from an Italian labor battalion the Germans had dragged to Normandy. McNiece had kept it because his own Thompson was scattered somewhere in the chaos of the D-Day drop, lost in the dark with half his gear. Now his Thompson was in that barn, and the barn belonged to the Germans. Corporal Byers lay beside him in the mud, face pale in the pre-dawn gloom, carbine clutched against his chest. "We don't have the men for this, McNiece." McNiece didn't answer. He was counting windows, counting shadows. The Germans had taken the position 40 minutes ago, quiet, professional, slipping through the fog while the exhausted American sentries nodded off. 2 men had made it out. The rest were dead or captured. And McNiece, returning from a supply run with demolition gear, had arrived just in time to see muzzle flashes blooming inside windows he'd slept beneath the night before. The barn mattered. From its second-floor loft, you could see the entire causeway. You could watch the road. You could spot German armor forming up a mile away. If the enemy held that barn past sunrise, they'd see every move the engineers made. They'd bring up mortars. The whole operation would collapse before the bridges were properly rigged. McNiece's hands tightened on the Beretta. The metal was cold, slick with moisture from the Norman night. Somewhere behind them, Private Hodge and 3 other scattered paratroopers from the 506th were waiting for orders, waiting for McNiece to decide what came next. He could hear his uncle's voice, rough and Oklahoma plain, talking about bar fights back in Ponca City. "You go in hard, you go in fast, but you don't lose your head. Controlled aggression, boy. You make them react to you." This wasn't a bar fight. This was worse. Because if they didn't take that barn back in the next 20 minutes, a lot more men than McNiece would pay the price. Byers shifted beside him, boots squelching in the mud. "What are you thinking?" McNiece checked the Beretta's magazine. 30 rounds. 1 spare mag in his musette bag. Not much. Not nearly enough for what he was considering. "I'm thinking," McNiece said quietly, "that sometimes you can't wait for the right weapon or the right number of men. Sometimes you just use what you've got and hope to hell it's enough." If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. Part 2. The barn had been quiet for 2 days. Too quiet, McNiece thought now. They should have rotated the watch more frequently, should have kept the men sharper. But exhaustion was its own kind of enemy in Normandy, heavier than the German 88s, more persistent than the rain. The 506th PIR had been scattered across the Norman bocage since the jump 6 days earlier. McNiece's stick from the filthy 13 had landed 3 miles off the drop zone, waist-deep in flooded fields, half their equipment lost in the dark. The demolition gear he'd been carrying, TNT blocks, blasting caps, detonation cord, had survived only because he'd waterproofed it obsessively before boarding the C-47. They'd reached Carrington 2 days late, assembled from a dozen different units, all of them exhausted and running on adrenaline and bad coffee. The mission was simple on paper. Secure the southern approaches, give the engineers time to rig the causeways and bridges for demolition, deny the roads to German armor pushing up from the south. The barn had been the key. Solid stone walls, good sight lines, defensible. McNiece and 8 other paratroopers had held it for 48 hours, watching the flat fields and narrow roads, calling in reports whenever they spotted movement. Lieutenant Garrett had visited the day before, a West Point officer who looked at McNiece's unwashed face and non-regulation haircut with visible distaste. The Filthy 13's reputation had preceded them, troublemakers, rebels, the squad that shaved their heads into mohawks and painted their faces for the jump. "You're holding this position until relieved, Sergeant," Garrett had said, maps spread across a makeshift table. "The engineers need 3 more days, maybe 4. McNiece had nodded, not mentioning that they were down to 2 days' rations and the men hadn't slept more than an hour at a stretch. Now Garrett's orders meant nothing. The barn was gone, the Germans had it, and McNiece was crouched in a ditch with a captured Italian submachine gun, trying to figure out how to take it back before the sun rose and revealed the American engineers working along the causeway. Byers spoke quietly beside him. "You know what they'll say if this goes wrong." McNiece knew. They'd say the demolition NCO from the Filthy 13 had gotten men killed with another reckless stunt. They'd say he should have pulled back, waited for support, followed procedure. "And if we don't try?" McNiece asked. Byers looked at the barn, at the faint glow of a cigarette in one of the windows. "Then the engineers die when the Germans spot them, and the whole mission fails." McNiece felt the weight of it settle across his shoulders, the same weight he'd carried since D-Day, since the first time men looked at him and waited for him to make a call no one else wanted to make. In his hands, the Beretta felt a little less foreign. Part 3, the plan formed in McNiece's mind the way demolition plans always did. Not from manuals or diagrams, but from reading the ground, the enemy, the terrible arithmetic of what was possible versus what was necessary. Hodge crawled up through the hedgerow behind them, a lanky kid from Tennessee with scared eyes and steady hands. 2 more paratroopers followed, Ramirez and Cole, both from different sticks, both looking at McNiece like he might have answers. "We going in?" Hodge asked. McNiece studied the barn again. The Germans were settling in, not fortifying. That was the window. That was everything. In another hour, they'd have machine guns positioned, fields of fire established, maybe even called for reinforcements. "Left side," McNiece said, pointing. "There's a gap in the hedgerow about 40 yards out. They haven't covered it yet because they're still getting organized. I go through there, straight to the barn wall. Byers and Hodge give me covering fire from the tree line. Ramirez and Cole move up once I signal." Byers stared at him. "You're going alone?" "Somebody has to get close first," McNiece said. "They're expecting us to either pull back or wait for daylight and more men. They're not expecting one crazy bastard to come through the fog with a captured Italian gun." "That's because it's suicide," Byers said flatly. McNiece checked his watch. 40 minutes until dawn. The engineers would be visible by then, silhouetted against the causeway, perfect targets. He thought about his uncle's words again. Aggressive control. Not reckless, not panicked, hard and fast, but disciplined. Make the enemy react to you, don't react to them. "I've been in plenty of bar fights," McNiece said, trying to make it sound lighter than it felt. "Same principle applies. You hit first, you hit hard, you stay calm enough to finish what you started." "This isn't a bar fight," Hodge said quietly. "No," McNiece agreed. "It's worse, because if I screw this up, you boys have to explain it to Garrett." Nobody laughed. The joke fell flat in the cold Norman air, mixing with fog and fear. Cole spoke up for the first time. "What if you don't make it?" McNiece looked at him, really looked at him. Cole was maybe 19, face still soft with youth despite 6 days of combat. He deserved honesty. "Then you pull back," McNiece said. "You get word to Garrett. You tell the engineers to hurry the hell up, and you don't try to be a hero." "Understood?" They nodded, but McNiece could see it in their eyes, the same thing he felt twisting in his own gut. Fear, doubt, the knowledge that what came next would be decided by split-second choices, by the reliability of a foreign weapon, by luck McNiece wasn't sure he had. He chambered around in the Beretta, felt the action slide smooth and cold. Time to find out if aggressive control works in Normandy, he muttered. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Part 4. McNiece moved through the fog like a ghost with a foreign heartbeat. The Beretta was light in his hands, almost too light. Every step across the open ground felt exposed, vulnerable. He could hear German voices from the barn, casual conversation, someone laughing. They thought they were safe, thought the Americans would pull back and regroup. Byers' carbine cracked from the tree line. The sharp report split the pre-dawn quiet. Hodges' Garand boomed a half-second later. The Germans in the barn shouted, confused, firing blind into the fog. McNiece used the chaos, crossing the last 20 yards at a crouch, pressing against the stone wall just as a burst of MP40 fire raked the hedgerow where he'd been moments before. His breathing came fast and shallow. The Beretta's safety clicked off with a sound that seemed impossibly loud. McNiece's hands were steady, despite the adrenaline screaming through his veins. Controlled aggression. Not reckless. Not panicked. The barn's side door hung open, broken from earlier fighting. McNiece counted to 3, listening, boots on stone, someone shouting orders in German, the metallic click of a weapon being reloaded. He went through the doorway low and fast. The Beretta spoke first, 3 round bursts, controlled, precise. The weapon's bark was different from a Thompson, sharper somehow, less throaty. A German soldier stumbled out from behind a broken wagon, helmet crooked, rifle swinging toward McNiece. The Beretta bucked. The man fell. McNiece kept moving, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. Through the smoky interior, past overturned furniture and scattered equipment. A Wehrmacht trooper appearing in a doorway. Another burst. The man dropped. Close quarters chaos. A potato masher grenade skittered across the floor. McNiece dove behind a collapsed beam as the explosion shook dust from the rafters. His ears rang. The Beretta was still in his grip, magazine half empty. His hands found the spare mag by touch, ejected the old one, slammed the new one home. The movements were automatic, drilled into him through hundreds of repetitions. Another German coming through the back entrance. McNiece fired. The 9mm rounds punched through the doorframe. The soldier fell backward into the fog. Then, silence. Heavy, ringing silence broken only by McNiece's ragged breathing and the distant crack of Byers' carbine providing cover. Boots crunched on rubble outside. "McNasty?" Hodges' voice, cautious and shaking. "Clear," McNiece called back, voice hoarse. "Get in here." Hodge and Byers appeared in the doorway, weapons ready, eyes wide. They stared at the interior of the barn, at the 4 German bodies, at McNiece standing among the wreckage with the Italian submachine gun still warm in his hands. 2 wounded Americans were huddled in the corner, paratroopers who'd been captured when the barn fell. One of them, a kid named Peters from Ohio, looked at McNiece like he was seeing a ghost. "Jesus Christ," Byers whispered. "You actually did it." McNiece didn't feel like he'd done anything except survive. His hands started shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. He set the Beretta on a stone ledge and pulled out a bent cigarette with trembling fingers. Through the barn's upper window, he could see the causeway. The engineers were still working, unaware of how close they'd come to disaster. Part 5. What nobody asked McNiece, what he never volunteered, was how close it had come to complete disaster. The Beretta had jammed. Not in the doorway, thank God, but in those first critical seconds inside the barn. McNiece had fired the initial burst at the first German soldier, felt the weapon buck in his hands, and then nothing. The bolt had locked back, a spent casing wedged in the ejection port. For 3 heartbeats that felt like hours, McNiece had stood completely exposed in the barn's entrance, fumbling with an unfamiliar weapon while German voices shouted somewhere in the smoke and darkness. His training with the Thompson was useless. The Beretta's mechanics were different, the controls in different positions. He'd cleared the jam purely by accident, slamming the bolt with his palm in frustration, the casing popping free just as a German soldier appeared around the corner. McNiece had fired from instinct, not skill. The burst that dropped the man had been more luck than marksmanship. Everything after that had been running on terror and adrenaline. The assault that Byers would later describe as textbook, and that Lieutenant Garrett would write up as exemplary initiative under fire, had actually been McNiece stumbling through smoke with a half-familiar weapon, making split-second choices that could have killed him as easily as they'd saved him. The grenade. McNiece had seen it hit the floor and had dove for cover without thinking. If it had rolled 3 feet to the left instead of the right, he'd have been caught in the blast. Pure chance. Nothing to do with skill or courage. The final German soldier at the back door. McNiece had fired blind, panic shooting, praying the Beretta wouldn't jam again. The fact that he'd hit the man at all was luck. The fact that the weapon had kept functioning was a minor miracle. Now, sitting on a broken crate with the cigarette burning down to his fingers, McNiece stared at the Beretta and felt the weight of what nobody would ever know. The citation would call it courage. The men would call it McNasty being McNasty, somehow pulling off the impossible again. Lieutenant Garrett would shake his head and mutter something about reckless NCOs getting lucky. But McNiece knew the truth. He'd gone into that barn terrified, with a weapon he barely knew how to use, and had survived more through accident than design. The aggressive control he'd talked about had dissolved into chaos and panic the moment he'd stepped through that door. Hodge approached cautiously, offering a canteen. "You okay?" McNiece took a long drink, buying time to steady his voice. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't mention the jam, didn't mention the terror, didn't mention that his hands were still shaking and would shake for hours afterward. Some things you kept to yourself. Some parts of the story stayed locked inside, carried forward into whatever came next. The Beretta sat on the ledge, silent witness to the truth it would never tell. Part 6. Lieutenant Garrett arrived an hour after dawn, stepping carefully through the barn's wreckage. He surveyed the scene, the German dead, the rescued Americans, the shattered equipment, with an expression McNiece couldn't quite read. "You were ordered to hold this position," Garrett said finally, "not retake it." McNiece met his eyes, too exhausted for diplomacy. "If we'd held back, the engineers would have been spotted. Mission would have failed." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "I'll need your report by this afternoon. Keep it simple." The report McNiece wrote was 2 paragraphs. Enemy seized observation post. Position retaken with minimal friendly casualties. Engineers able to complete demolition work unmolested. Recommendation: rotate sentries more frequently. He didn't mention the Beretta jamming. Didn't mention the grenade that should have killed him. Didn't mention that the whole assault had been held together by luck and terror in roughly equal measure. Garrett's official action report was longer, more formal. It used words like initiative and exemplary courage under fire. It recommended McNiece for a Bronze Star. It made the whole thing sound clean, professional, heroic. The Filthy 13 kept the Beretta for 3 more weeks. McNiece used it in 2 more skirmishes near Carentan before it finally jammed for good during a firefight at St. Lo. He tossed it into a ditch and picked up a Thompson from a dead paratrooper, felt the familiar weight return to his hands. But he never forgot the lesson the Italian submachine gun had taught him. 30 years later, Jake McNiece stood in a hardware store in Oklahoma, and the sound of a nail gun echoed like gunfire in a stone barn. His hands tightened on the shopping cart. His breathing went shallow. For a moment he was back in Normandy, back in that doorway, back in the smoke and chaos, with a weapon jamming in his hands. The episode passed. They always did. But they never fully left. People sometimes asked him about the war, about the Filthy 13, about the actions that had earned him medals he kept in a drawer and rarely looked at. They wanted stories about courage and heroism. They wanted the clean version from the reports. McNiece usually gave them something close to that. He'd learned that people didn't want to hear about jammed weapons and panic and the way luck decided who lived and who didn't. They wanted to believe that courage meant something more than just being too stubborn or too terrified to quit. The barn near Carentan was footnoted in a few histories of the Normandy campaign. Position retaken through aggressive action by elements of the 506th PIR. One sentence. One clean line in a book full of maps and arrows. McNiece remembered it differently, remembered the weight of that Beretta, remembered his hands shaking for hours afterward, remembered the faces of men who'd looked at him like he was something he knew he wasn't. The legend was light, the memory was heavy, and 30 years after Normandy, McNiece still carried both. Udil, if this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.